It was the dead of night when the scratching started again. The sharp sound of claws against wood broke the eerie silence of the dark, isolated cabin. Emma had been living alone for the past 6 months, ever since her husband, Josh, passed away in a car accident. The pain of losing him still weighed heavily on her, but life, as it always does, moved on. She tried to find solace in the solitude of their home, tucked away in the forest, surrounded by trees that whispered in the wind and the distant howls of wildlife. Emma sat up in bed, startled by the noise. It was a sound she had become all too familiar with in the past few weeks, the scraping against the door. At first, she thought it was just the wind or perhaps a tree branch brushing against the wood, but now it was impossible to ignore. The sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Something, or someone, was out there. She pulled the blanket tighter around her, her heart pounding in her chest. Every night for the last 3 weeks, the scratching had come at precisely the same time, right around midnight. And just as it had started, it stopped, leaving Emma wide awake, staring at the door, wondering what could be causing it. Was it an animal, a wild boar, a coyote, or was it something else? Every time, she'd go to the door, her breath shallow and uneven, heart racing, and peek through the peephole. But every time, nothing would be there. The porch remained empty, bathed in the pale moonlight. It was maddening. There were no signs of forced entry, no prints in the dirt outside. It was as though the scratching was a cruel game played by the night itself. Tonight felt different, though. The scratching was louder, more insistent. It was almost as if it was calling to her, demanding her attention. Emma slid out of bed, her feet hitting the cold wooden floor with a soft thud. She walked toward the door, her eyes never leaving the faint outline of the scratched wood. The door was old, weathered by years of wind and rain, but it had always felt secure. She had no reason to believe anything could get through it. But tonight, something in the air felt off. The stillness of the night seemed too thick, the air too heavy, as though it were holding its breath. Emma's hand hovered over the doorknob, her mind racing. Was she being paranoid? Was it just the grief, making her mind play tricks on her? She couldn't tell anymore. All she knew was that the scratching had to stop. With a deep breath, she twisted the knob and opened the door, just a crack, ready to face whatever might be waiting on the other side. The wind rushed in, cold and sharp, carrying with it the smell of pine and damp earth. The door creaked, echoing through the stillness of the night. But as she peered outside, there was nothing there. The porch was empty, bathed in the pale light of the moon. No animal, no creature, no sign of anything that could have made the sound. She stared out into the darkness for a long moment, her heart still pounding in her chest. Maybe it was nothing after all. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it, a movement. It was quick, just a blur, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. She turned sharply, but all she saw was a dark expanse of the forest, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Was she losing her mind? Was she imagining things? But then, she heard it again, the scratching. It was coming from the far side of the porch, just out of sight. Emma's blood ran cold as she slowly turned her head toward the source of the sound. There, nestled between the shadows, stood something huge. Something with glowing eyes that shimmered in the moonlight. The creature was crouched low to the ground, its fur thick and dark, its muscles rippling beneath the matted coat. Its eyes locked onto hers, unblinking, as the scratching continued. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The creature was no animal she had ever seen before. It was far too large, far too intelligent, and its gaze was filled with something primal, something unsettling. It didn't belong here. Without thinking, Emma slammed the door shut, heart racing in her chest. She backed away from it slowly, her mind struggling to process what she had just witnessed. Had it been a wolf, a bear, or something else entirely? It didn't matter now. What mattered was that something was out there, and it wasn't going away. The scratching didn't stop. If anything, it became louder, more insistent. Emma could hear it even through the thick wood of the door, echoing in the quiet house. She glanced around the room, searching for some sense of safety. She was alone, but her mind couldn't help but feel like she wasn't. There was something in the forest, something watching her, and it had made its presence known. Her eyes flicked to the window by the door, where the moonlight filtered in, casting long shadows across the floor. She took a hesitant step toward it, but before she could reach it, the door rattled violently, as if whatever was outside was trying to break in. The sound of claws scraping against wood filled the house, louder and more frantic now. Emma's heart raced as she pressed her back against the wall, the fear gnawing at her insides. The creature outside was relentless, its claws digging into the door as though it knew she was inside, hiding, waiting. She couldn't stay in the house. But where could she go? There was nothing around her for miles, just the woods and the mountain that loomed in the distance. If she ran into the forest, would it follow her? Would it be even more dangerous out there? Her mind raced through every possible scenario, but all of them ended with one terrible thought. She couldn't stay here. She needed to leave. With one final glance at the door, Emma grabbed her coat and bolted for the back exit. As she turned the handle, she heard the door rattle again, louder this time, as if whatever was outside was growing impatient. She stepped into the cold night air, every sense heightened, every muscle tense. She had no idea what was waiting for her out there, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't go back inside. Emma ran into the night, her boots pounding against the dirt path that led from her cabin into the woods. The trees seemed to close in around her, their twisted branches reaching like skeletal hands from the darkness. She didn't know where she was going, but she couldn't stay in the cabin, not with whatever had been scratching at her door. The fear was all-consuming, and it pushed her forward, driving her to move faster, to leave the safety of the familiar and dive into the unknown. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, mostly focused on the creature outside the door. What was it? Why was it coming for her? She couldn't shake the image of its glowing eyes, how they seemed to pierce through her very soul, demanding her attention. That wasn't just an animal. No animal would behave like that. It had been deliberate, intelligent. It had been hunting. But who or what could be hunting her? Emma shook her head, trying to dispel the thought. She couldn't think about it now. She needed to focus on surviving, on getting away. As she stumbled through the underbrush, her breath coming in sharp gasps, she realized how out of place she felt. The woods, once a place of calm for her, were now foreign and threatening. It was the isolation of the forest that had once been a refuge, a place where she could find peace after the tragedy of losing Josh. But now it felt like a prison. It felt like a trap. She'd married Josh when she was just out of college. He had been her best friend, her partner in everything. They'd moved to the cabin together to escape the hustle and bustle of city life, to create a home in the quiet beauty of nature. It was supposed to be their dream, and for the first few years, it had been. They spent weekends hiking, cooking together, enjoying the peace of the land. They never had children, but they had each other, and that was enough. Then, Josh died. The car accident had been sudden, unexpected. He'd been on his way to town when another driver swerved into his lane, colliding head-on with his car. Emma had been the one to identify his body at the morgue, to see the blank, lifeless expression on his face, and she had never been the same since. She had felt the weight of the loss settle in her chest, suffocating her. The grief had been a constant companion, and the silence of the cabin had only deepened her sense of loneliness. The only comfort she had was the memory of Josh, and even that was starting to fade with each passing day. Now, months later, Emma was left to navigate life without him, in a world that felt unfamiliar and strange. She tried to move on, to find her footing, but the weight of her grief kept pulling her back, trapping her in the past. And the cabin, once a symbol of love and shared dreams, had become a place where the memories of Josh were too strong to escape. As she trudged deeper into the woods, Emma's thoughts turned inward. She thought of the people she had once known, the friends and family who had tried to comfort her after Josh's death. But none of them truly understood what she was going through. How could they? They hadn't lost someone they loved, someone who had been their whole world. They couldn't know the loneliness that came with the silence, the sense of being utterly alone in a world that kept spinning without her. Emma's eyes welled with tears, but she wiped them away angrily. She had no time for that now. She needed to stay strong. She couldn't let fear consume her, not when she was being hunted by something that wasn't even human. The woods were eerily silent as she continued to walk, her legs growing sore and tired. The only sound was the crunching of leaves beneath her feet, the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But Emma's senses were heightened, and every sound seemed amplified. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see the glowing eyes of the creature stalking her. But each time, the woods remained empty. It wasn't until she reached the old stone well near the edge of the forest that she stopped. The well had been there when she and Josh first moved to the cabin, an ancient structure that had been used by previous settlers. They had always joked about how eerie it was, how it seemed like a forgotten relic of some long-gone time. But now, standing there in the darkness, it felt like a safe haven. At least it was familiar. Emma sank down onto the edge of the well, trying to catch her breath. Her chest heaved with exhaustion, and her mind raced with questions she had no answers to. What was that creature? Why had it been scratching at her door? Was it a warning? Was it trying to tell her something? She didn't know, but she felt a gnawing unease in her gut, an instinct telling her that she was in grave danger. She thought back to the past few weeks, to the strange occurrences that had begun happening in the cabin. The scratching at the door had started out as an oddity, something she could dismiss. But now it was undeniable. Something was trying to get to her, and she had no idea what to do about it. Just then, a sound pierced the stillness, a twig snapping in the distance. Emma's heart skipped a beat, and she froze, her eyes scanning the darkness. She wasn't alone. She wasn't imagining it. The creature, or whatever it was out there. Panic surged within her as she stood up, her breath quickening. She didn't know where to go, didn't know how to escape. Her eyes darted around, looking for any sign of safety. But the woods felt like a maze, a trap closing in around her. And then, a low growl broke the silence. Emma's blood ran cold. It was close. Too close. Emma's pulse raced as a growl echoed through the trees, its deep, guttural tone reverberating in her chest. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and every instinct in her body screamed for her to run. But her legs felt as if they were made of stone. She stood frozen at the edge of the well, eyes scanning the dark forest around her, desperately trying to locate the source of the sound. The growl came again, closer this time, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate the very air around her. Emma's breath hitched in her throat as she instinctively took a step back. The shadows moved, twisting and bending, making it impossible to tell what was real and what was just a play of the moonlight through the branches. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last. She needed to move. She needed to get away from the sound, from whatever was out there. But her body wouldn't obey. Fear had paralyzed her, and every second felt like an eternity. The forest, once a place of calm and peace, now felt like a wild labyrinth, alive and hungry. And then she saw it. A pair of glowing eyes pierced through the darkness, shining like beacons in the night. The eyes were impossibly large, wide and unblinking, and they seemed to lock onto Emma's own gaze with a predatory intensity. Her breath caught in her throat as a creature stepped forward from the shadows, revealing itself fully in the dim moonlight. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't a bear. It was something else entirely, something ancient and primal. The creature was massive, its body thick with muscle, covered in matted, dark fur that seemed to ripple with every movement. Its snout was elongated, sharp teeth glistening in the light, and its claws, long and menacing, dug into the earth as it stalked closer. The air around it felt charged with a terrifying energy, and Emma's body trembled in response. It wasn't just an animal. It was a creature that had been born of nightmares, an embodiment of fear itself. It moved with deliberate grace, its massive form gliding through the shadows as if it had been lurking there for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. Emma's mind raced. What was this thing? Why was it here? Was it the same creature that had been scratching at her door? The pieces didn't fit. There was no explanation for any of it. Nothing made sense anymore. The creature took another step forward, its glowing eyes never leaving hers. Emma's heart thundered in her chest, her body frozen in place, unable to tear herself away from the creature's gaze. She could feel the weight of its presence, as if the very air had thickened around her, pressing down on her shoulders. Every breath she took was a struggle, each inhale feeling like it might be her last. Suddenly, the creature let out a low, bone-chilling growl, a sound that sent a ripple of fear through Emma's entire being. It wasn't a sound meant for intimidation. It was a sound of hunger, of something desperate for its next meal. Emma's legs finally unlocked, and she spun on her heel, ready to run, but the creature was faster. Before she could take a single step, the ground beneath her feet shifted. The earth seemed to tremble, and the trees surrounding her groaned, as if the forest itself was alive, closing in around her. Her feet slipped on the wet leaves as she stumbled, desperately trying to regain her balance. But it was no use. The creature was on her. It moved with lightning speed, its massive body closing the distance between them in the blink of an eye. Emma screamed, the sound raw and panicked, as she flung herself forward, just barely avoiding the creature's claws as they slashed through the air behind her. She scrambled to her feet, her breath ragged and uneven, and glanced back. The creature had stopped, but only for a moment, its glowing eyes watching her every move with that same unnerving calm. It wasn't chasing her. Not yet. But it was waiting. Waiting for her to make a mistake. Waiting for her to tire. It knew she couldn't run forever. Emma's mind raced, trying to think of a way out. The cabin was too far away, and the creature was too fast. Her only chance was to keep moving, to stay ahead of it, to find some kind of shelter in the woods, somewhere it couldn't reach her. But where? She had no idea where she was in the forest. The paths had all blurred together, and in her panic, she had lost any sense of direction. She was completely lost. The creature's growl came again, this time more menacing, more insistent. Emma didn't have time to think. She turned and bolted, her legs carrying her as fast as they could through the trees, the sound of her own footsteps muffled by the dense underbrush. Her body was exhausted, every muscle aching with fatigue, but she pushed herself harder, faster. She couldn't stop. Not now. If she did, she knew it would be over. But the forest seemed to stretch on endlessly. The darkness closed in around her, and she realized with a sickening dread that she had no idea where she was going. The trees all looked the same twisted branches and rustling leaves. Her thoughts were a blur, and she couldn't focus long enough to come up with a plan. And then, just when she thought she might collapse from exhaustion, she heard it. A voice. It was faint, barely a whisper carried on the wind, but it was enough to stop her dead in her tracks. She turned toward the sound, her heart leaping in her chest. It wasn't the creature. It wasn't the growl. It was a voice, human. Someone else was out there. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen in place, trying to discern the voice that had just whispered through the trees. Was she imagining it? Her breath was shallow, and the panic clawing at her insides made it difficult to focus, but she couldn't ignore the possibility. The voice had been too real, too clear to be a trick of the wind. For a moment, she considered running again, her legs ready to sprint in any direction, but something in that faint voice held her still. It had been human. There was no mistaking it. And in that moment of despair, when everything seemed hopeless, the thought of someone else out there was the only lifeline she had. She had to find them. They could help. They could. A rustling sound broke through her thoughts, followed by a faint footstep. It wasn't the creature. It was another human, moving cautiously through the underbrush. Emma swallowed hard, her throat dry, as she strained her ears to catch any further sounds. The voice came again, louder this time, more urgent. "Emma, over here. Hurry!" Her heart leapt at the sound of her name. She didn't recognize the voice, but in her panic, it didn't matter. Someone was here, someone who had called her out by name. The voice was a beacon in the overwhelming darkness, offering the hope she had been craving. With newfound determination, Emma pushed forward, ignoring the exhaustion that made her limbs feel heavy and weak. She wove between the trees, moving as quickly as she dared, all the while listening for any hint of the voice again. She could hear nothing but the rustling of leaves beneath her feet, the occasional snap of twigs, and her own frantic breathing. But she kept going, kept trusting that the voice would lead her to safety. Then, as she rounded a bend in the path, she saw it, a faint flicker of light up ahead, cutting through the dark like a lighthouse in a storm. It was a campfire, small and flickering, casting warm, golden light against the backdrop of the forest. Emma's breath caught in her throat, and she pushed herself harder, her heart racing with anticipation. She was almost there. But then, as quickly as the light had appeared, it was gone. The fire had gone out, leaving only darkness behind. Emma stopped dead in her tracks, panic surging within her once again. She had been so close to finding something, someone that might have been her salvation. Just then, she heard the voice again. This time, it was much closer, much clearer, as if the person was standing just a few feet away. "Emma, you have to keep moving. Don't stop." Emma spun around, eyes wide, scanning the trees, her pulse hammering in her throat. But there was no one in sight, just darkness, stretching endlessly before her. The voice, whoever it belonged to, had come from the shadows, and now it was gone again. A growl interrupted her thoughts, deep and menacing, rising from the heart of the forest. It was the creature. It was back. Before Emma could react, the air around her seemed to shimmer, and a shadow moved quickly across her peripheral vision. She whirled, eyes wide, expecting to see the creature closing in. But it wasn't the creature that stepped into view. It was a man, tall, with rugged features and a face that was hardened by years spent surviving the wilderness. His eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. He was dressed in thick, weathered clothes, a knife at his side, and his expression was unreadable. "I'm not going to hurt you," the man said, his voice low and steady. "But you need to come with me. Now." Emma's mind was spinning, her body still trembling from fear. This man had appeared out of nowhere, just in time to save her. But who was he? And why was he in the woods at night? And how had he known her name? "Who are you?" Emma whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "What's happening here? Why? Why is this happening?" The man glanced back over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing as though he were expecting the creature to appear at any moment. "No time for explanations," he muttered. "That thing is hunting you. It won't stop until it gets what it wants." Emma's heart sank at the man's words. "What does it want? Why me?" "I don't know," he replied quickly, grabbing her arm gently but firmly. "But we don't have much time. We need to move. Now." Before she could ask another question, the man began pulling her through the forest, his pace quick and urgent. She stumbled behind him, trying to keep up, but her legs felt like lead, her body drained from the fear and exertion. Every step seemed to echo through the trees, and every rustling of leaves made her think the creature was closer, lurking just beyond her reach. As they moved deeper into the woods, Emma glanced over her shoulder one last time, hoping to see the cabin in the distance, a sign of safety. But all she could see was darkness. The world around her had become a maze of shadows, and the familiar had turned into a nightmare. The man led her to a small clearing, surrounded by thick trees and a canopy of leaves that blocked out most of the moonlight. There, hidden among the underbrush, was a small, makeshift shelter, a tent that had been hastily thrown up, but it was sturdy enough to protect from the elements. "Get in," the man urged, his voice insistent. "We'll be safe here for now." Emma hesitated, her mind racing. She had no idea who this man was or what he wanted, but she had no other choice. If she stayed out there, in the open, she was as good as dead. With a nod, she stepped into the tent, her heart pounding as she glanced back toward the trees. But the man wasn't done. He quickly pulled a knife from his belt, gripping it tightly in his hand. "Stay quiet. If you hear anything at all, you stay down and keep your mouth shut." The tension in the air was palpable, and Emma could feel the weight of the moment. Whatever was hunting her was close, and now she was no longer alone in facing it. The tent was small, just enough space for Emma to curl up on the cold ground, her back pressed against the damp earth. The man, whose name she still didn't know, crouched near the entrance, his eyes darting between the trees and the clearing. The atmosphere was thick with tension, an oppressive silence hanging over them. The air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Emma's mind was in a whirlwind. She had gone from being alone in her cabin, terrified of an unseen creature, to running through the woods with a stranger who claimed that something was hunting her. And now, here they were, hiding in the dark, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Her body was exhausted, her muscles sore from the sprint, but the adrenaline coursing through her kept her wide awake, her senses heightened, every sound in the forest magnified. The man's grip on his knife never loosened, his gaze fixed on the shadows around them. Emma glanced at him, studying his features in the dim light. He looked rough, weathered by years in the wild, but there was a kindness in his eyes, something that seemed out of place in this grim situation. He was trying to protect her, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that he, too, was hiding something. Something he wasn't telling her. The silence was broken by the faintest noise, a rustling in the distance, followed by a low growl. The hairs on the back of Emma's neck stood on end, and her body stiffened in fear. The creature was close, closer than she had ever imagined. The growl was different this time, more guttural, as if it was speaking to them, daring them to make a move. The man's eyes flicked to Emma, his expression hardening. "Stay low," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "And don't make a sound. If it finds us, we're dead." Emma nodded, her throat tight with fear. She had never felt so vulnerable, so utterly helpless. She had been running on instinct for so long, trying to survive, trying to outrun the fear. But now, it felt like the fear was catching up to her. It was relentless, suffocating, and it was in every breath she took, every heartbeat. She thought of Josh then, his smile, his laugh, the way they would sit together on the porch, watching the sunset, feeling the peace of the land wash over them. She thought of the life they had built together, the dreams they had shared. And now, that life was gone. He was gone. Her eyes burned as tears threatened to spill, but she quickly wiped them away, not wanting to show any weakness. She couldn't afford to break down now. She couldn't afford to let the fear swallow her whole. The man shifted beside her, his voice a soft murmur in the darkness. "You're not alone in this," he said, his tone more reassuring than she expected. "I know it feels like it, but you're not. You're stronger than you think." Emma looked at him, his face half lit by the dim light filtering through the trees. There was something in his voice that made her believe him, something raw and real. She had spent so many months feeling alone, isolating herself in her grief. But here, in the darkest of times, she was not alone. There was someone beside her, someone willing to fight for her survival. The man turned to face the entrance of the tent, his grip tightening around the knife as the growl grew louder, closer. Emma's heart raced in her chest. She had no idea what kind of creature they were facing, but she could feel its presence, a dark, suffocating energy that pressed in on all sides. She thought of the scratching at the door, the relentless pursuit, the feeling that something had been stalking her from the very beginning. It wasn't just her life that was at stake now. It was everything. "Don't move," the man hissed, his eyes scanning the edge of the clearing, his body tense. The growl was now a low rumble, reverberating through the ground beneath them. Emma's eyes widened in terror. She couldn't see the creature, but she could feel it, its presence looming, waiting. The man was right. It was waiting for them to make a mistake. And she knew they couldn't afford to make one. And then it happened. A shadow broke through the trees, massive and dark, moving with a fluid grace that made Emma's breath catch in her throat. She could see it now, its glowing eyes fixed on the tent, its body hulking and ominous, a creature born from the deepest fears of the forest. It was the thing that had been scratching at her door, the thing that had been hunting her, and now it was here. The man didn't hesitate. He surged forward, his knife raised, ready to defend. But before he could make a move, the creature lunged. It was all a blur, too fast, too violent. The man's shout echoed in the clearing, but Emma barely heard it over the roar of the creature. She scrambled backward, her heart in her throat, as the sound of the struggle reached her ears. The man fought with everything he had, but the creature was relentless, its strength overwhelming. The fight seemed to go on for an eternity, each moment stretching out, filled with terror and desperation. Finally, with one last, desperate cry, the man was thrown to the ground. The creature stood over him, its glowing eyes fixed on Emma, its growl low and menacing. But as it stepped closer, Emma's instincts kicked in. She grabbed a sharp rock from the ground and hurled it at the creature with all the force she could muster. It struck the creature in the face, distracting it just long enough for her to make a break for it. She didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. All she could do was run, pushing herself through the trees, her legs burning with exertion, her lungs aching for air. She had no idea where she was going, no idea what would happen next. But one thing was clear. She wasn't going to die here, not like this. The woods blurred around her, and her heart thudded in her chest as she pushed forward. For the first time in months, she felt alive again. The fear was still there, but it was no longer overwhelming. She had fought back, and she would keep fighting, no matter what came next.